Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about the impact federal funding has here in Stark County. We really appreciate you joining us for this discussion this morning. My name is Amy Krebs with Stark Community Foundation, and we are bringing you this webinar along with Sisters of Charity Foundation of Canton, represented by Marisa Roan, who serves as president, and the Center for Community Solutions, represented by Emily Campbell, who serves as Chief Executive Officer. One reason we wanted to bring this informational webinar to you is because federal funding streams are a frequent topic of conversation. And frankly, they have been for years because it has been a dominant funding source for not all, but many nonprofit organizations. And federal funds then have been all the more a focus this year. And because of that, thought we may all benefit from learning more about these funding streams and how they work in our community. We will look to share the latest updates that we are hearing over the next hour. I wanted to share a little bit about my perspective here at Stark Community Foundation and what we are seeing, keeping in mind what our vantage point shows may be different what Marisa and her team sees and other foundations, and may also look different to you, dependent on the sector and the reliance, frankly, on federal dollars. Our funds at a community foundation are reflective of the interest of our growing donor base. But I would say that the large majority of nonprofit organizations are really in observation mode. They're keeping a pulse within their respective networks regarding how changes will impact their programs and services, and maybe working, at least we hope so, all the more with their boards to prioritize and examine what their organization may realistically be successful at carrying out in the community. And I will say I've seen a real uptick of organizations going about strategic planning right now. Along with that, we also hear of frustration on the ground as it connects to federal grants. A contact that you may have had is no longer there. A deadline that you have worked with over time doesn't exist. You can't get a definitive answer on what that may look like. And potential funding pools, while they still may exist, have significantly shrunk, or those dollars are being designated to other areas or repurposed to new opportunities. So that's the large majority from nonprofits that we're hearing. There is a smaller portion of NPOs that we hear from that have already seen or are experiencing, and in some cases, significant cuts. And I would say an equal amount of nonprofits have no concerns with regard to federal resources. And that isn't tied to any one sector. So I'll wrap up my comments, and I'd like to point out, and I'm sure Marisa and Emily would agree with me, but we recognize the challenge that NPOs are already under when it comes to workforce and capacity and the ability to effectively carry out your mission. So you add this challenge to it, and it may certainly focus on new ideas, new solutions, and we would suspect collaborative efforts and guided by data. What does the data tell us in our community where nonprofit organizations must be strong and situated to help meet the needs of our community and the opportunities? So I will turn it over to Marisa, and then Emily will walk us through what they are seeing regionally and of course here in Stark County. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I think you covered everything beautifully. I think everything that you're hearing, we're hearing as well. Quite a mixed bag. And I think the number one thing that we're hearing, the pain point or the frustration, is finding the information and having information that's consistent and accurate. And so I think our hope is that by bringing this webinar to you today and Emily's expertise, that we can provide a current snapshot on what is going on in the environment and how maybe you can react to it. And hopefully you can see this as a reliable source so that you're not trying to scramble and find all of the things in all of the different sources and try to piece it together. So this is really that one stop to try to help you understand the current landscape, realizing it could change tomorrow because that's the environment we're in. But our goal is to really help feed you that information that you can respond to and strategize around. And certainly we meet with many of you, we talk about those strategies and how we can help or if we can help. And I think this is just another tool in the toolkit to try to give you access to some really great, reliable resources. So we appreciate everyone joining us today. And I'll just leave it at that and turn it over to Emily. I think Amy did a really nice recap. So welcome, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you to Marisa and to Amy, and to all of you for joining. We're delighted to have you here today. I am joined behind the scenes here by my colleague Ebony Thornton, who is helping to run everything on the back end. As she noted in the chat, closed captioning is available. You just click the show caption button. Ebony, I didn't know before we get started if you wanted to share any additional housekeeping or if you wanted me to run through it.
Hi, everyone. I could do a really quick
Thank
housekeeping.
you.
I will do a 30-second cleanup. This is recorded and will be available on our website. You have the links in the chat, but you will also receive it after the event. If you have any questions, I am monitoring the chat. Just drop them in there. We'll share it with Emily and the team. And if you just want to connect, it will excuse me, all the resources along with how to contact the speakers will be also available on that same page with the recording. Have a great webinar and thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Ebony. So I'm going to run through a lot of information today. As you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or post them in the Q&A portion. I may answer some of them as I run through my presentation, and if not, hopefully we'll have some time at the end to work through questions. As this is a webinar, all of the participants are on mute, so typing is your best way to reach the presenters here today. So thank you again so much for having me here to share some information about where things stand right now. I really like the observation that Amy made about organizations being in observation mode. And one word that keeps coming to mind with me when I think about the external pressures on nonprofit organizations in Stark County and across the state, really the word that comes to mind is uncertainty. There is so much uncertainty, and we know that big things are happening, but we're not sure yet where things will land. And with every passing week, as policy processes in Columbus and in Washington, D.C. continue on their sort of normal schedule, we are getting more and more answers. Sometimes those answers are reasons for a little bit of relief. We can take a breath. Some of them are reasons for concern. And so I'll highlight today some areas that we're watching at the Center for Community Solutions, and we would suggest that you all keep an eye on. So the Center for Community Solutions is an independent, nonpartisan policy and research center. We have been headquartered in Northeast Ohio since 1913, celebrating 112 years of working at the intersection of health, social, and economic conditions. We do this and we serve our mission through nonpartisan policy analysis and advocacy, which will be a lot of what I talk about today, but also applied research work. And so, we're able to slice and dice data to really analyze census information, funding information, to be able to present data that is timely and reliable for locally meaningful geographies like county. And so we really focus on trying to bring together the data and the evidence to illuminate something important about the community, to suggest sustainable solutions to communities' issues, and we actively engage in advocacy to try and influence public policy. So that's a little bit more about community solutions. I'm sure Ebony will drop our overall website in the chat. So there are new and substantial external pressures on nonprofit organizations and those working to address community conditions. The date of January 20th is something that sticks in my mind. That was Inauguration Day in Washington, D.C. the real beginning of President Trump's current term. And right away, we saw an unprecedented, a historic amount of activity coming out of the White House. And it has let up a little bit since those very early weeks, but things continue to progress. Days after Inauguration Day, the New York Times was tracking all of the executive administrative actions from the federal level, and it was 126 pages long. So that gives you a sense of just the enormous amount of activity that is happening. And what we've seen is that a pattern of the White House announcing something, an executive order perhaps being issued, sometimes not. Sometimes things are announced and then never have an executive order. And then advocacy happens, court activity happens, things are paused, things are turned back on, things are rescinded. It's really an uncertain and chaotic time. And untangling all of it can be very difficult. No reasonable person could have foreseen just the level of information flowing to us. These are immense external pressures. It's a fast pace of change and a high level of uncertainty. Coming so soon on the heels of COVID-19 pandemic and the associated shutdown and social distancing, I know that my reserves from 5 years ago have been used, and I haven't had the opportunity to build them back up. And I hear from many organizations that, like, we were just kind of starting to get our footing or feeling a little bit like it was a return to what the new to normal or to what the new normal may be. And then we've got all this stuff sort of coming out of at us that is outside of our own control. And I want to talk a little bit later about some things that you can do to kind of gain some of that control back. The future of federal funding still remains uncertain, but decisions about potential cuts are already underway. There are debates happening just this week. And so, one should note again that the information that I'll share today is what's valid and as of today, but there could very easily be an announcement later today or something that happens that sort of changes the landscape. What we want to do today is help untangle some of the mess, cut through some of the noise, and provide some very practical suggestions about how to navigate the current environment. So, a note to begin with, we emphasized it as we were sharing information about this webinar that this is a nonpartisan conversation. The Center for Community Solutions has worked hard to cultivate our nonpartisan reputation, and we guard it very closely. I often put this at the end when we're talking about policy issues and advocacy, but I think it's important to share in the beginning because 501c3 organizations are nonpartisan in law, in fact, and in purpose. Nonprofits are vital service providers, employers, and economic drivers, and regardless of how nonprofit organizations may be labeled, charitable organizations exist to serve the public good, providing essential services on which people depend in every community across the country. Nonpartisan means that we evaluate policies and issues based on their merits, not based on who put them forward. And specifically for nonprofit organizations, the IRS specifically allows engagement, even in certain lobbying activities, not to mention advocacy and education. But what is prevented is 501c3 organizations engaging in election activities for partisan elections. We can work on levy campaigns, we can work on issue campaigns, but we need to stay away from campaigns related to individual partisan elected elections. Once someone is in office, we can work with them because they then become a community leader, and we can advocate and talk to them about issues that are important to our community and the people that we serve. So we always at Community Solutions work with the office, not necessarily with the person. So whoever is in the governor's office, we will work with or try to work with. Same goes for our congressional delegation. And there's always opportunity to find common ground. So you will hear me today talk about Republicans, talk about Democrats, talk about the president, talk about these kinds of things. These are policymakers, and these partisan considerations are very important. for understanding where things may be heading in some of the decisions. And so we will keep our conversation very nonpartisan, but nonpartisan doesn't mean not controversial. So these two posters, I think, really give us a sense of how things have changed. For decades, government action has been plodding, slow, measured, fairly predictable. Things took a long time, and for better or for worse, most change was incremental rather than transformative. The keep calm and carry on motto, developed in World War II, was a clear message of sober restraint, as was said. That's all over now. The second thing that you see, Move Fast and Break Things, is a poster that was found on the walls of Facebook offices around the world. It emphasizes speed, it emphasizes a willingness to experiment and iterate, even if it means making mistakes. And one of the things that people that have worked in public policy for a long time, including myself, have been struck with is the flip-flopping that's happening. Everyone in a department is fired. Now all of a sudden we're hiring them back. That's not a failure in the move fast and break things aspect of things. It's exactly how it's supposed to work. Cut everything down, see what's really important, add those things back in. This is really different. And it implies that there's a focus on speed and experimentation, learning from failures, adapting to new challenges, very different from a cautious, slow approach to making some of these decisions. Completely different. So, how do you keep calm and carry on in a move fast and break things environment? A sober assessment of risks and impact, and we'll spend a lot of our time today talking about that. Maintaining clarity and focus for your own organization and the importance of your work for the people that you serve and what you are trying to achieve. Maintaining your adaptability and not panicking, holding a little something back, a little bit of energy back to be able to respond to the next thing. In some ways, we're also in a hurry up and wait kind of environment. We have to be ready at any time to make changes and to execute, but we spend a lot of time listening and waiting and speculating about what may happen. So I've talked about external pressures. I don't want to spend a lot of time here because y'all know what they are. We have the federal funding freeze that happened in the first days of the Trump administration, then the unfreeze. And we are, just like Amy, hearing about organizations who their funding's been cut, then it's been turned back on, then you know, bill it right now, but only for these things, for only this short period of time. Much less predictable than federal funding has been in the past. And then even if the funding is still flowing, the people who process that funding may not be there. There may be no one to answer the question because of the reductions in the federal workforce. I mentioned the executive orders already. I do want to highlight the impact that executive actions around diversity, equity, and inclusion and DEI are having very real impacts on organizations, rethinking how we all talk about our work, how we present our work. And we had heard of a situation, and maybe some of you experienced this, where organizations that were providing out of school time activities had to completely change their intake forms in just a few days. They had like a few days to do it because they were asking questions about race and gender that were no longer considered valid things for them to take into consideration of their programming. You know, the mass termination of federal employees means that the people just aren't there to continue to do the work. At the same time that all this is happening at the federal level, we have our ordinary schedule of state budget deliberations. Those things are also happening right now. So the federal budget is in the US Senate. The state budget is in the Ohio Senate. So everything's in the Senate, but two very different conversations happening. And so this puts a lot of pressure on people that work in public policy. Our team had planned to spend a lot of time in the first 6 months of this year on the state budget. We've done that, but we've also had to redeploy and act very quickly because, as you'll hear in a moment, what the federal government decides will immediately and definitely impact what the state of Ohio is able to do. And then we have the federal budget and policy debates. It's the business of policymaking as usual, but in this changed environment. So let's talk a little bit about why we care so much about federal funding. And we had the graphic before of the question mark with the big tangle of the knot. That's sometimes what it feels like to try and follow the money to the original source and to untangle um, the federal funding, because federal funding is underpinning the state budget, county budgets, city budgets, and some nonprofit organization budgets. But it's all mixed in together, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. Ebony is putting in the chat a series of reports that have been produced by my colleagues, led by Dylan Armstrong, including Dr. Susanna Teese and Kyle Thompson, to look at the information, untangle everything, figure out what the federal funding is. And here's where they've landed. And we're focusing here on health and human service investments in Ohio because that's what our organization focuses on. And you can see the pie. 62 cents of every dollar invested in health and human services in Ohio originates at the federal government. If that piece of the pie is cut significantly, the other sources cannot make up the difference. And so what we are looking at is a smaller pie overall, not sort of a supplanting from the other pieces of it. 42 cents of every dollar allocated by the state budget, or $38 billion, originates at the federal government. That's more than state sales and income tax combined. Statewide in 2021, close to 20 cents of every dollar in county budgets originated at the federal level. In Stark County, it was 19.77% of the county budget was actually federal funds, and that's a greater share than the state average of all 88 counties. So although it may be your funding may be a county contract, it can still originate at the federal level and be impacted by all of this. Policy Matters Ohio identified $41.3 billion coming to Ohio for childcare, transportation, infrastructure, housing, workforce training, healthcare, and much, much more. And so while there are immediate impacts from federal funding changes, there's also ripple effects, and there isn't a part of response to community issues that may not feel some of those ripple effects as we have some of this constriction and as the overall pie shrinks. This is how we support services in our community. These were decisions that were made to invest in issues very important to the community. And some nonprofit organizations, as many of you know, were set up specifically to be able to bring to action the resources that were coming into the community for various purposes. Untangling all of that, turning off the spigot, can be very, very harmful. In past economic downturns, in past challenges, the federal government has bailed us out, at least for the almost 2 decades that I've been doing this work here in Ohio. The feds always come and save the day, whether it's through ARPA, whether it is through stimulus dollars. That's not happening this time. The other thing that is substantially different this time around than in past funding crises is that philanthropic funders are also under pressure and feeling the pressure and a target. And there are specific federal actions and specific things that are in the federal budget that's flowing through that are targeted to philanthropy and to foundations, especially those with large endowments. Part of it is tied in and tangled up with higher education and universities, but there are other things that will impact foundations. And so their choices are also constrained in what they're doing. And we are seeing, especially in some other communities, less in Stark County, that the boards of philanthropic entities, especially foundations in some United Ways, are very worried and concerned about protecting their ability to continue to invest in community over the long term. So very different from the COVID crisis and the kind of rapid response funding that we saw then. Federal funding underpins much of how the Stark community addresses issues. Here's the scope of investment in health and human services in 2023. Again, this is research from my colleagues at the Center for Community Solutions that was released late last year. $805 million was Stark County's single year total in all of the health and human services portfolio. You can see it broken down there. You all are a little unusual. Typically, federal is above county levies and philanthropic. For you, it's a little bit lower. I think part of that has to do with the demographics and the socioeconomic status of some of the people within your community. But Stark County, of that 805 million, 700 million are state dollars that include federal dollars as allocated as part of the state budgeting process. Stark County represents the 7th largest amount of any county in the state of state dollars or funding that's flowing from the state through the state budget to entities within Stark County, not just the county government itself. So if you take that red 701 million and we bring it down, looking at the latest available data. So at the top, we're looking at 2023. At the bottom, we're looking at 2024. Again, the latest available data. These are the state departments that have the largest allocations for Stark County. The very top is Medicaid at $683 million. That's more than half of all of the funding allocated by the state budget that comes to Stark County people and Stark County entities. 70% of Medicaid funding statewide originates at the federal government. 424 million comes to Stark County people and entities through the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. 27% of education and workforce funding statewide originates at the federal government. Between those two, it's well over 80% of the dollars that come to Stark County entities and people, and they're underpinned by federal spending. Much, much less in higher education. It's $39 million, only about 1% is federal funding there. Although we've seen in higher education that some of the restrictions and some of the executive orders are having a greater impact on how they do their job and do their work, perhaps, than the funding is. And $34 million through the Department of Developmental Disabilities came to Stark County, allocated by the state. 63% of all of the spending under that Ohio department is underpinned by federal funding. So although you see the state is where the decisions are made, the money originates at the federal government. And so this is why we really can't talk about the state budget in 2025 without talking about the federal funding and the federal budget. As I mentioned, 19.77%, so almost 20%, or 20% of Stark County's, the county government's budget, is federal funds. That's $136.85 for every Stark County resident, allocated through the county budget, originating at the federal level. Because we're talking about federal advocacy, we also did some research to look at federal investments by congressional district so that we could reach out to our congresspeople and ensure that they realize and understand the impact that this is having on communities and that changes could have. Stark is split between 2 congressional districts, District 13 represented by Amelia Sykes and District 6 represented by Michael Ruley. You are a partisan split in Stark County. So District 6, as you can see, has the highest per capita investment per resident of any congressional district in the state of Ohio. This is a large geographic district. Congressional districts all have about the same population, but it's a very large geographic spread. So Stark County, and as well as Eastern Ohio bordering Pennsylvania and West Virginia and including Appalachian Ohio, the largest amounts coming to people and entities in Ohio District 6 are for the Department of Agriculture. A lot of that is SNAP. Department of Education, and Department of the Treasury. So those are a lot of direct investments in people or funding for people to meet their basic needs. Entities in District 6 received the most investment of any district in the state from the Departments of the Interior, Homeland Security, Agriculture, and Education. These supported hunger relief, watershed restoration, disaster relief, local emergency services, and educational responses to COVID-19. District 13 is the northern half of Stark and then also Summit County, represented again by Amelia Sykes. In that district, the largest contributors in federal funding are the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Education. Here's the point. A lot of federal funding is coming into this community, is going directly to support the individuals and families that you serve via public benefit programs. And if and when these resources go away, who's going to respond? The other aspect that we're paying attention to are the broader economic impacts of some choices. We're not going to talk about tariffs today, but I do want to mention employment and workforce. There are almost 114,000 federal employees living in Ohio as of last year. It was the 11th highest in the nation. The current unemployment rate for Ohio is around 5%. If all the federal employees in this state lost their jobs, that rate would have a 40% increase. And so these are people that may have been your supporters in the past, may become your clients as some of these broader economic and labor forces begin to fall down. And so when we think about good policy, it's all very precariously balanced. We've had a prolonged period of expansion in programs, expansion in funding, expansion in the number of nonprofits, and what our nonprofits were doing. We've added upstream, we've added equity and inclusion. These changes impact all these things, and some of them may literally turn back the clock. As the federal government paid for more, it meant that state and local resources could be devoted to other things, to local needs, and sort of a federal first motto. If the feds were paying for it, great. And if not, then we'll see what we can do with the dollars that we no longer have to spend. That's changing and changing rapidly. It's like the feds have cut up the credit card. I would love to see this done strategically. It hasn't been. We all know about Doge. Elon Musk has left Doge, but the activities of cutting funding fast, looking for these huge buckets that can be cut, and worrying a little bit about how these things stack together will continue and remain. I see a question in the chat about federal employees. It does not include government contractors. It is only the federal employees themselves who are, specifically federal employees. If they're contractors working for a nonprofit or for-profit, they're not counted in that number. So you see how these things can continue to have ripple effects. Here's what I want to remind you. Even in the face of federal cuts, we still have choices. The state could decide to continue support for programs with state funds. The county could opt to do more and to introduce new supports, but it's a zero-sum game and it is a shrinking pie. And so we could decide to provide services in different ways or limit the scope, geography, or eligibility, or we can choose to shut down immediately or to continue. And so seeing how these things continue to flow through community is something that's really important. That's the environment. Let's talk about what's happening this week. Federal budget deliberations are underway. As I mentioned, the budget is in the Senate this week. Committee hearings are happening. We're hearing rumors that by the end of the week, we'll see Senate versions of the specific bill. It is H.R. 1. Its short title is officially One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Other people call it the mega bill. It is mega. It is over 1,000 pages. And digging through all that, reading through all of it is difficult. Congress is trying for budget reconciliation. This is a process that has limited debate rules in the Senate, so only needs a majority to pass instead of 2/3 majority, which would invoke cloture. There's limits to reconciliation. We could have a whole webinar on it. Ebony will she's dropped in the chat the budget reconciliation process and the big, beautiful bill language that you can take a look at yourself. Point being, the U.S. House met their self-imposed deadline to finish it before Memorial Day, deliberated through the night, starting at 1 a.m., finishing with a vote at 6 a.m. It passed by one vote. Very contentious. U.S. Senate committees are meeting this week. The Senate Parliamentarian yesterday sent a list of changes that need to happen in the House bill for it to be considered under Senate reconciliation rules, because the reconciliation rules in the chambers are different. And we're also waiting for to see if any other policy comes out based on the Byrd rule. This was named for former West Virginia Senator Byrd, who said that reconciliation can only be used for financial matters. And so if there are other policies, they cannot be considered under reconciliation. And we think there are some things that will be pulled out based on the Byrd rule. The Senate has a goal to finish by their July 4th state work period, when they adjourn for a week or two and come back to their states. The House and Senate must ultimately pass identical versions to present to the president for signature. This is proving a real sticking point because the House and the Senate don't agree on different things. And in this very complex environment, every vote counts, as we will see in a moment. Here's what we're seeing overall. A strong desire by both the federal and state policymakers to cut taxes or to maintain tax cuts and to reduce spending even beyond the foregone revenue that's a result of introducing or maintaining those tax cuts. And they are all looking to push the pain down to smaller levels of government. The feds saying the states can make up the difference. The states saying, oh, the counties can make up the difference, and so on and so forth. So to sort of say it's not our fault, these issues should be determined at the local level. The problem is the local level, as you saw, has far fewer resources to address concerns. And so I'm happy to answer some questions about specifically what's in the bill. I'll talk about that and what I'm most concerned about, I think, in a moment as we continue through. All right, so what can you do given all of this? Here's a bit of a playbook that we've pulled together to help organizations and their boards think about how to respond in the moment or what to look for. And I'll walk through each of these. But if you take only one piece of advice away, it is this. Get very clear, very quickly within your leadership and your board about what is fundamental to your organization. What is at the core of your work? How would you fill in the blank of if this went away, the organization as we know it would cease to exist? For the Center for Community Solutions, my organization, if independent analysis and nonpartisan policy and advocacy work went away, we've lost our mission. And so recognizing that you're not going to be able to keep everything most likely, what do you do really well? And what is the special thing that you add to the community that if we lost it, we could not bring it back? All right. The first step, uncover the truth. There's lots of back and forth. There's lots of media reports about what's in and what's out. Until we actually see the executive order, we don't know what's in there. About a month ago, there were rumors that there were going to be a bunch of executive orders about 501c3 status. They never came to pass. It just didn't happen. There were even media reports about what was in those. But as of now, we haven't seen them. They don't exist. There's lots of rumors, and it's kind of, I've heard it described as whiplash by other folks. And so here are 5 resources that we trust when the news and information move quickly. Funny to note that we wrote about this on our blog at Community Solutions, and it was the most popular piece during the first quarter of the year. Don't take anyone's word for it. Just because a public official says it doesn't make it true. Sort of wait to see the receipts, wait to see the evidence. So experienced journalists, original sources of information, that's like going back to the bill itself or going back to the executive order. official data like the census, and trusted partners in the community, which I hope you see Community Solutions as one of those. The other places are groups where partners work together. The National Council of Nonprofits has been amazing. The Coalition on Human Needs is a national group that looks specifically at health and social services. There are associations, there are state coalitions, and in Ohio, we have 3 human service chambers covering Franklin, Hamilton, and Cuyahoga County. So groups that come together, I know in Stark County, you have Family Council, you have some other places where there are coalitions of people who are coming together to look at community needs. The next thing that I want to suggest is to consider the risks and the direct impact on your organization. Think quietly and critically about what you can let go. You want to be able to make strategic changes, not have someone force those changes on you. And I've talked about ripple effects. I love this image because it's not just one ripple effect, it's many, many drops coming all at once that overlap. I see in the chat, HPIO is absolutely one of those trusted sources of information that we point to and use frequently, and we'll share some of their research in just a few moments. So, each of these ripples overlaps and has things radiating from them. And what I like to suggest is to think about the impact of a federal spending reduction in 3 separate levels. Primary is funding that your organization gets directly. This is a grant that has always paid for these services. It's being cut. We're going to have to figure it out. That's a direct impact. It has the most immediate impact. It's a primary impact. Secondary are funding which funds your organization's funders. The word funding is in there a lot. These are cuts or reductions that impact, for example, the state budget. If you receive state funding, it may be underpinned by those federal funds, or that impacts the county budget, as we've seen. If some of these things go away, county budgets are going to be strained, and county officials are going to have some difficult choices to make. So funding, which is a primary impact for your funders, are secondary impacts for your organization. Then there's the tertiary impact. So right now there are things in the federal government that would fundamentally change Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, would require Ohio to come up with up to $1 billion every year just to maintain current SNAP benefit levels. If that happens, I expect that the state may step in to supplant some of those dollars. I would expect that counties would step in to provide additional hunger assistance. But it's a limited pie. And so that means less dollars available for sort of nice to have things or upstream things when we're talking about feeding people right now today and preventing hunger. And so it's really important to think about, is this a primary thing? Is it a secondary thing? Or is it tertiary? They all impact your organization, but the scope and the pace of the impact are going to be different. Don't go it alone. Find partners. And here's where there's opportunity. I'm seeing a lot of strange bedfellows in some of these conversations. And there is protection in working collaboratively and not having your organization be out. We are hearing a lot of concern from organizations who are worried about engaging in advocacy because they don't want to be targets. I can tell you right now, we haven't seen any Ohio organizations that have been directly targeted for the advocacy that they are participating in. We've actually seen the opposite, where we've seen federal policymakers, especially asking in Northeast Ohio in particular, asking to hear from organizations and constituents about how these things may impact their communities as they're trying to educate themselves. But partners and champions can very much help protect all of us when we're doing some of this work. And then stop harmful changes before they go into effect. This is where advocacy comes in. And as I mentioned, nonprofit organizations can engage in advocacy. It's different than lobbying. Don't take my word for it. Here's what the IRS says. They specifically say that a 501c3 organization may engage in some lobbying, and they may involve themselves in issues of public policy without the activity being considered as lobbying. This is where education comes in. If you invite a policymaker to see your services, that's not lobbying unless you're asking them to vote a specific way on a specific bill. It's education to help them understand what's happening in their own home community, but don't electioneer. So we are seeing that advocacy works, and here's why. The margins are razor thin in the US House and the US Senate. It's really important to consider these. Over the past several decades, the caucuses, the Republican caucus, the Democratic caucus in Congress have tended to vote together in blocks. It has been an even stronger block for whatever party is in the minority, which right now are the Democrats. Being in the minority means not only you have fewer votes, but you also don't get to appoint any of the committee chairs. The majority party, which right now in the House and Senate, that's Republicans, appoint all of the committee chairs that have a lot of power. The two vacancies are due to the passing away or the deaths of two Democrat members. Those positions will be filled through special elections later in the year. What this means is that the margin is so close that it only takes 3 votes, 3 people from the Republican caucus to kill something in the House. We saw it. The big, beautiful budget bill, the mega bill, passed by 1 vote. But before that, it actually failed in the budget committee. And they had to make changes forced by individual members. We also heard that Ohio's delegation was instrumental in seeing language about the administration being able to label nonprofit organizations terrorist organizations and take their 501c3 status without due process and without any evidentiary requirements. That was removed from the House version, passed version of the budget, and we heard rumors that Ohio's delegation played a very important role in that. That was something that some of the members would not look at. When we look over at the U.S. Senate, it's a little bit different, but senators tend to be a little more independent minded, and the caucuses don't hang together quite so strongly. Both of our senators from Ohio, Husted and Moreno, are brand new, and so no one really knows. They haven't been on the record a lot in how they're going to vote on things. Husted in particular shows up on lists of advocacy targets for national organizations because he is up for re-election next year in a special election. He's finishing out the term, and so because of that, anyone that has an election looming is considered to be on those lists. Every vote counts. And this is where all of a sudden we can have influence, and we are seeing that advocacy works. We are seeing it every day in news reports and statements coming out from the Senate, the US Senate in particular. Yesterday was a big day where senators have backed away from a trial balloon that they floated about cuts to Medicare because of the lack of popularity. Concerns about Medicaid cuts, saying that there was a powerful senator yesterday that said to reporters that if SNAP cuts are made, if the SNAP cuts that are being considered are made, the Republicans will lose their majority in Congress. The stakes are very high for them, which means that there's opportunities to share how these things would impact our organizations and our communities. Here's the thing, the very high level of federal cuts that are being considered in Congress, you cannot do without fundamentally altering public assistance programs. You see it here. The red were the cuts that were required. We kept hearing, oh, we're not going to touch Medicaid. We're not going to touch Medicaid. The math didn't math. You couldn't do it without touching Medicaid. And ultimately, they did make a number of changes to the Medicaid program, which would make it much more difficult for people to maintain their coverage. And okay, they're not specifically cutting people off the program, but the savings are coming from making it so difficult that the number of people on the program shrink. I call that a cut. But again, every vote matters. And when we think about Medicaid, there's trigger language in the state budget. Community Solutions has written a lot about it. As things stand today, in the version of the state budget that came out in the Senate yesterday, the trigger language remains. It says that if the federal government changes the federal matching percentage or the amount that they're putting in for Medicaid benefits for the expansion population by even 1 cent, that Medicaid and expansion shall be eliminated. we are advocating every day to get that one word change from shall be eliminated to may be eliminated. Because right now in the federal budget, there is a very nuanced piece that says that if Ohio continues to cover a small portion of legal immigrants, a specific portion of legal immigrants, if they allow them to have Medicaid, then Ohio's federal matching percentage will go from 90% to 80%. 80 cents on the dollar is still a good deal, but if that comes to pass and the trigger language is still in the budget, Ohio would be triggered and Medicaid expansion disappears overnight. One word could cost 770,000 Ohioans their health coverage, including, I have the number here somewhere, thousands in Stark County. This is the trigger language. Okay, so thinking about timing, what's a today problem? What's a future problem? Executive orders go into effect within days. Most legislation, it's 90 days. July 1st is the state budget. This is a little bit of an old slide. So it's the end of this month, not 3 months from now is when the new state budget will go into effect. October 1st is when new federal appropriations go into effect. And in January 2026 is when Medicaid work requirements in Ohio, under some proposals that are in there now, would go into effect. So here's the point. The deliberations that are happening in Congress right now are looking at future spending, and there will not be the same legal opportunities that there have been to block some of those changes that there have been up to this point. Once it's passed into law and the president signs it, that's what it's going to be, and there is very little recourse for advocates or others. So what we'd suggest you do, let go of some things, but be strategic. Recognize what you can change and still keep that fundamental aspects of your organization. Don't try to look too far in the future because there's no way to know what tomorrow brings. Accept that so much is unknowable. Find the sources of information that you trust. Take breaks because this is a marathon of sprints, but we need to be able to maintain our energy if we are going to be able to respond. If something isn't yet official, that means it's advocacy time. Did you receive official notice? Then you need to act. If it's a rumor, don't worry about it yet, unless you're acting but for strategic reasons. Compliance in advance only makes sense if it's strategic. Think about whether things have direct impact in your organization and how fast these changes will be made. I think the most difficult time for nonprofit organizations is going to come later in this year when the state budget is done, when we have a good idea where the federal budget is, or if it may be done, and we are all preparing our budgets for next year because we're going to have some answers and have to make some difficult choices, not to mention overall recession issues. So we have more information about what's in the state budget, but let me kind of leave you with this in our very few last minutes here, and thank you for your time and attention today. The state budget includes this language highlighted here that if the federal government reduces, discontinues, pauses, or otherwise suspends any federal program that provides federal funds for any corresponding state program, such program may be reduced, discontinued, paused, or suspended. Medicaid has a more strict trigger, which that it says not may, but shall. So this is for anything. And when looking at the information for the proposed state budget, state legislators have not taken into account any possible federal cuts. So when those come and when the allocations are lower for certain programs that Ohio was counting on based on what's happened in the past, and that's how you've got a budget, is look at what's happening in the past, we will see additional state cuts. So some of these conversations will not be over by July 1st. I expect that we will see either corrections bills in the state or canceled grants, or maybe never allocated grants. You know, there's lots of different things that the state can do. We have some examples from past economic downturns, specifically the Great Recession, where the state just kept cutting and cutting and cutting because they ran out of money. But it's not going to be over. And so although we will have more certainty by the end of this month about the state budget, we should not feel settled or that is the end of it. So I'll leave you with this. Here's some suggestions about what to do right now. Don't panic. Advocacy and litigation are working. We see examples of that every single day, and voices about how things may impact communities are really making a difference, especially those organizations that stand up and say, for example, I provide after school support for kids, to provide mentorship, to put them on the right path. But I'm worried about snap cuts because those kids are going to come to my program hungry and they are not going to be able to take full advantage of the great services that I'm providing. It's those kinds of messages which are making a difference. Don't stop serving your mission. Keep your mission in the forefront. Share what you know and what you do and why what you do is important and making a difference in community. Get your board involved. These are financial considerations. The board has a fiduciary responsibility. They can sometimes see beyond and think about sustainability in ways that those of us doing this work every day, it is very difficult to do. Take some calculated risks, but take them calculated. And don't point fingers. We can't point fingers at each other. We are all under immense pressure. And in order to do this, we are going to have to think of ourselves as a whole community, providing supports, providing excellent services so that our communities can thrive. And when you're taking those calculated risks, there are some things that if they change, they will never come back, but there are things that may be paused. And so this is some framing to think about as we figure out how to move forward. There's a webinar coming up later this month. The link isn't out yet, where G2G Consulting and the Human Service Chambers across the state will be digging into impacts on Ohio of current federal budget proposals. And so when that comes out, we'll certainly share it with you. But please be sure to check our website frequently and sign up for our 5 things you need to know email. If you don't already, it comes in your inbox every Monday with our top 5 things that we think folks should be paying attention to. And I'll leave you with this in our last minute. This is one of my favorite quotes that I have been thinking about almost every day since Inauguration Day. It comes from Timber Hawkeye, who is a Buddhist scholar. You can't calm the storm, so stop trying. What you can do is calm yourself. The storm will pass. This storm will pass, and it is up to us to figure out how much the ripples flow and how much impact it has on our own communities. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I think we can stay for just another moment or two if there are questions, but I think we have been trying to pay attention to them as they come. We see a question. We will be sending these links via email. Actually, we'll be sending you a link to our website where everything shared today will be there, a one-stop shop, so that you don't have to gather them in all the different places. But thanks so much for your time and attention today, and look forward to collaborating and working together as we continue to untangle this.
Hey, Emily, just real quick
Sure.
before we end, we do have one question, and it was, is Fed percent higher for higher education when federal research grants are considered, or does the 1% include their research grants?
That is a great question. I almost put that on the slide, but I didn't. So the federal percent is definitely higher. That 1% was only the federal funding allocated by the state that goes through the State Department of Higher Education. So there is a ton of federal funding that goes directly to universities that supports all kinds of things, including their research grants, and is causing a lot of pressure. So yes, in the full higher education ecosystem, I don't know the exact percent, but it's much, much higher. That is just that one little piece of it, and the funding that's allocated by the state budget for through the Ohio Department of Higher Education. Great question. All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining. It's been great to be here and share this with you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me, to Sisters of Charity, to the Stark Community Foundation if you have additional questions or would like more information. And we will be sure to get the information out to you, that link, possibly later today, so that you have it all there and can share it widely. Thank you so much. Have a great day.